Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country, around the world, inside Ukraine, inside Russia, anywhere else you can hear my voice. The war in Ukraine continues to evolve by the minute. And you've heard many perspectives, and I don't think you've heard one like the one we're going to get today. This is a man who is a returning champion, joined us at a very interesting time last time, and is joining us at a very interesting time again. A guy I'm honored to know, a guy I'm inspired every time I hear him talk. The great and powerful Chris Fussell is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, Chris.
Thanks, Paul. Great to see you again.
So we were reminiscing. I'm saying welcome back because I looked it up. The last time you were with us was April 6th, 2020. You were the last live interview I did before the pandemic. You remember that?
I do, yeah. I remember you and I standing outside of your studio in New York and looking at the empty streets and thinking, I think this is going to be a pretty serious episode here. And that was the last time I was in New York City.
You gave us, I think, a really smart warning of what was to come. And I think you and I were, gaming out scenarios, and we've talked about most dangerous course of action, most likely course of action. I want to get to Ukraine. I want you to break down the battlefield. I want you to help us understand why it's going the way it does. But now that we reflect on 2 years of the pandemic, can you give me any thoughts now that we are, almost 2 years from when last time I spoke to you, 2 years after the pandemic, as that battlefield unfolded? Can you give me your thoughts, analysis, reactions?
Yeah, I remember when you and I were talking, it was right in the front end. There were maybe a couple thousand deaths in the U.S. at that point. But I've been through enough weird stuff in our lives. You could sort of see something strange coming. And then I remember sharing with you an immunologist friend of mine who had said, our early data, analysis says this could be 250,000 to north of 300,000 or 400,000, somewhere in that range of deaths, and could take 12 months to 18 months to settle through. And I remember that was like shocking to us. And here we are, probably end up threefold that. And, the normalization of this stuff has been a real eye opener, how people have sort of accepted this new reality in some ways that I think is very unhealthy for us as a society. At the same time, we've seen some miracles of science, some miraculous ability of resilience in our culture. And then on the other side of that, just this massive polarization that's been very disappointing to watch. And, all of us have fallen prey to it. What could have been a coalescing event has, pushed division further into our society here in the U.S. And some of which I would say maps directly to creating opportunity for folks like Putin to take advantage of around the world.
I want to go deeper on that, but I don't want to skip over a question I ask of everyone. Last time we were in New York together at the Car Club. Where are you and how are you?
I am. So you know this. Shortly after our conversation 2 years ago, 2+ years ago, my wife and I made the decision to move from Capitol Hill in D.C. up to the beautiful mountains of West Virginia. So we've been here for about 2 years. So if you're on video, that's the sun passing over the New River Gorge in West Virginia. The nation's newest national park is just outside of our window here, and we're enjoying it. We're really settling into a state that we've been coming here for many years. We know it, we love it, and really enjoying the new approach and opportunities here in West Virginia. Wife and kids are doing great.
So you're a dynamic guy. You're always ahead of what's next. And on this show, we always want to talk about not just what's happening now, but what's happening next. So I think, you've always been working in a dynamic way on the battlefield, in your business and now in whatever is coming. So you seem like, I remember you were talking to us about how work would change, how leadership would change. And you've leaned into that personally and professionally. Now we've got Ukraine. I think the reason I want to talk to you, Chris, is because I feel like we've heard from lots of generals. And then we've seen really narrow perspectives, but we don't have a really dynamic perspective. And you can see all sides of it based off your very unique experience. Maybe let's just start at the top. As we have this discussion, it looks like Ukraine is winning. It looks like Russia is losing. But give us your analysis, the big picture of Ukraine, what's happening and what it means globally. And then I want to go down to more granular and tactical stuff. But give us your thoughts on the big picture of where we are and where this may be going.
Yeah, maybe I just first react, and like yourself, had a bunch of countless of these conversations the last few weeks. And the one caveat I always try to put in, and we can dive into this a bit and then go wherever you want. But I think we've done ourselves a disservice in the U.S. over the last several generations, really, but especially in the last 20 years, when we frame things like this inside of winning and losing, right? We, and you and I both lived this, right? We dealt with this. We did this to ourselves in Iraq and Afghanistan because, we kept looking for winning. Have we won yet in Afghanistan? Did we win in Iraq? Who's winning in the Ukraine? And conflict at that level, nations are in relationship with one another. And saying, did we win in Afghanistan, or is Putin going to win in Ukraine, is like saying, am I going to win at raising my kids? I just have a relationship with them. I have good days and bad days, but if there's not a time when I'm like, I won, we look at things like that in these very complex relationships. Putin has made some serious errors, in my opinion. He's messed up that relationship, both with the Ukrainian population, neighboring states, the world, etc. But neither side is really going to win. It's going to transition into another stage, and we want to help them get to that next stage as fast as possible. And so, I mean, you can beat this point up for a while, but I do think it's important because it changes our mindset. We start to look for, by April 27th, we will have won. Well, that's not true. By April 27th of 2035, we won't have won. It'll be in a much different position, hopefully. And how do we help them navigate towards that? But you have to look at these things in such a longer and different perspective, much like you would relationships with friends and family.
I think that's a fantastic way of looking at it. I appreciate that you're bringing that perspective because it's not one we're really hearing. And especially, the cable news chatter kind of treats it like a scoreboard. How many tanks are down? How many chips are here? It's like some kind of, broadcast game of Risk in 2022. But as we go onto the actual battlefield, let's just use that, right? If you're a retired quarterback, that played at the very highest level possible, you're watching the game unfold. And I don't mean to call it a game, you know what I mean. But you have a very unique perspective on the battlefield that maybe other folks don't see or don't know. What do you see on the battlefield?
A few things. I'd start with, again, for your listeners, I was in the SEAL team, so small specialized units, which live on one end of the spectrum where, very capable, much larger forces like you were part of, like conventional units, et cetera. We all live on this spectrum, but, like you and I both lived, you immerse with each other enough on the battlefield where you understand sort of broad perspective. And so from that lens, one of the first things that jumped out at me was the decision to cross the border. I was surprised by completely. I thought there's like 8 wins that Putin gets out of getting to the border, forcing the conversation, and then backing down and saying he never meant to. I don't know why everybody overreacted, right? And so the crossing into the country seemed like a strange decision. I didn't see a lot of ways he won there. But then the first thing that jumped out was he sort of fell into the dictator autocrat trap of getting clearly really bad intelligence from his frontline, majors and colonels on their readiness, right? And in systems like that, we saw the same thing in Iraq with Saddam having bad internal intelligence on his capabilities. If you're going to be in a lot of trouble with an autocrat as a military officer by saying your tanks aren't ready, you're going to say they're good, right? So he was probably suffering from some of that. He also probably cared less about their capability and losses than other countries would. Again, a trap that autocrats fall into. But he got pretty exposed very quickly, right? There's this saying in Alfred Thayer Mahan was this Navy theorist strategist, and one of his best known theories was the fleet in being. Like you're better off with your naval fleet existing in a harbor than you are taking out to sea and proving that it's not very capable. And so he sort of broke this. And I say, the collective, Russian forces broke this sort of key point of strategy. Now he looks rather exposed. He also went in with small numbers, with the population size of Ukraine, to go in with, less than just under 200,000 troops, 20 to 25% of which are conscripts. And, for listeners that aren't aware, I mean, conscript around the world, these are like, they're kids. It's like an 18-year-old kid who's maybe got, a couple of weeks of training. And that, I'm sure they're taking the bulk of the losses. It's like conscripts and generals that are getting killed over there, which is, again, just its own little mini humanitarian crisis that kids like that are being thrown to the front lines for no reason. But small numbers, less capable force, immediately exposed. Those are the things that jumped out at me very quickly. Coupled with, obviously, he thought it was going to be low resistance. Otherwise, why would you do it the way they did it? And it wasn't. The Ukrainian people are tough. They didn't want to be occupied. God bless them for the resistance they put up. And, Putin knows Ukrainian history. That's a tough crowd, right? And they've been through hard times before. They can suffer, and they turned it on. And, obviously, Putin and his forces are paying the price for it. So I guess overarching, my response has been a series of surprises. Like, I've been surprised that they crossed the border, surprised that he thought that his units were more capable than they were, and then happily surprised by the will and strength of resistance from the Ukrainian people.
I want to maybe start and go down. And let me ask you, there's been a lot made of, I don't know what they're up to now, 7 generals killed so far. Maybe it's more by the time we record this. Can you talk about that? What does it reveal? How much does it matter?
How much
and by the way, just sorry, before I get you that, you were an 06, so you were just below a general in the U.S. military. So you're one level below a general. And to set the context here, I don't know if we lost any generals in post 9/11. Maybe I don't think any.
No, that was 2 levels. So I was in 05.
Sorry, 05. Correction. Thank you. Thank you.
But worked around the generals on staffs and stuff, and so yeah, I think we lost one in it was an helicopter accident.
Yeah.
You had the occasional general that was wounded here and there, being out with their frontline folks. But yeah, it's rare, and that goes back to throughout history. I think the biggest thing that it shows us is the Russian military isn't that experienced. Neither were we on 9/11, right? That's not like a condemnation. You and I both know, like, you can train all you want at some big training ground, and then you get shot at, and that's a totally different type of real training, right? You learn much faster in those circumstances. The U.S. military is really good, as are some of the allies we worked with so closely over the last 20 years, because we've been through 20 years of combat, which is not a great reality, but it does make your army really good, right? And Russia just hasn't had that. They've got very limited number of folks that have real combat experience, some of which have promoted up to the general officer level. And so my assumption is they're in the back of these big convoys that are pushing in. Their comms are probably terrible. Like, I'm guessing the intricacies of it all. It's not like it looks in the movies, right? Some kid in a tank or a vehicle way up in the front of the convoy, his radio battery dies because he doesn't know how to keep the battery stored in cold weather, and suddenly can't talk to anybody, and the whole convoy shuts down, et cetera, et cetera. And now you've got some general in the back who actually knows what they've got to get done, because he's the only person talking back to headquarters. And he probably hops in a Jeep and, like, I got to drive up there and see what the hell's going on. And the Ukrainian sniper's like, oh, good, look, an old gray-haired guy. And you lose a general, right? I'm guessing it is mostly just practical interaction between those big movements, because they don't have the sophisticated infrastructure to talk to one another. They haven't done big movements like that, especially under fire. And so it turns into a bit of a cluster, right? And so generals go up and try to sort it out, and they're great targets of opportunity. But mostly it exposes, like, so to your point, like, does it mean the leadership is, there's probably 7 more generals waiting to fill that role, but it does demonstrate to the world that level of, like, just, it's turned into a big cluster, and now their senior most guys are in the position of having to sort it out, which is not ideal.
And you, I assume, have trained alongside Ukrainians or fought alongside Ukrainians at some point, maybe in Iraq or Afghanistan. Can you talk about their fighting capacity, what you've seen? And in particular, I think there's been a lot made of javelins and stingers. Can you talk about those, like, put color on it, explain what they are, how they work, why they're significant?
Yeah, I didn't work closely with Ukrainians in either of the fights. I mean, they like rubbed shoulders a little bit, but back in the peace times, like we had a lot of interaction just in training operations and stuff over in Europe, and they had a great reputation. Rightfully so. Like as I was saying a moment ago, just a hard population that's been through a lot over many generations, and that creates a grit and resilience that's hard to match. And now living in West Virginia, I've had conversations just with friends here where they're without military experience. They're like, are you surprised by the local population being able to fend off the Russians? And honestly, I'm like, what I'll tell my friends here is, you could send the 82nd Airborne into West Virginia, and it wouldn't be able to take it over, right? It would stay here as long as it, and I say that in all honesty, my 82nd Airborne friends can yell at me, right? It would win every battle, and it would control the terrain as long as it stayed here, but you're not going to break the will of the West Virginia people. Like I said before, it would be a relationship, and just like we found in Afghanistan, like they've got the staying power, right? And if I've learned anything, like I'm sure you would say as well, the last 20 years, it's bet on the people with a reason to fight. Compare the 30-year-old parent living in, Kiev with the 20-year-old conscript who thought he was going to an exercise. Who's got the will to fight, right? So you're not going to break that sort of will to defend your homeland. And history just shows that time and again, right? And so they've got all that in orders of magnitude more than the invading and occupying force. And then you leverage on top of that, to your point, like this tech imbalance, right? And for those that haven't been out there, you can talk about any specific weapon system, but the broader way I think of it is, for those that haven't seen it, like if you can get that mismatch shored up, and here we're supporting the defending population and force, you can get into this sort of order of magnitude difference in capabilities, right? And the Russians are using, untested soldiers with untested equipment and logistics on the ground, and realizing, wow, there's technology that will flood across the border for as long as we want to stay engaged here. That is a mismatch with the capability that we've brought into the country. So we've got what we thought was a great tank, but this Javelin is much better than it is, right? And oh my gosh, that wasn't here 2 weeks ago, that weapon system. So clearly somewhere along the border, there's an exchange happening. There's some sort of training taking place that, I can do the math, like the weapon wasn't here, now it is, and it was just used very effectively. So that training was probably like a matter of hours. So it's a pretty simple system to teach a fighter how to use, and just took out one of my tanks. And I can count the number of tanks I have. I have no idea how many Javelins they're willing to flood into this country, as one of any number of examples. Now that said, that mismatch isn't unusual. I'm sure you crossed the border into Iraq in a thin-skinned Humvee, right? That probably had like canvas doors, and we really quickly learned, hey, there's a mismatch here, right? There's less technical weapons, but they can shred through these vehicles. And so what did you do? I'm sure Private Smith was out, bolting steel onto the side of your Humvee to try to keep from getting blown up, right? There's Russians doing the same thing right now, getting creative, because you adapt very quickly under the pressure of combat, and they're going to do the same thing. But we have this, rather than, we're not flooding like IED makers in to support the Ukrainians. We're flooding in some of the best weapon systems the world's ever known, and giving them this asymmetric advantage.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it feels like that the Javelins on this battlefield are what IEDs became on our battlefield, but on steroids and so much quicker, right? I mean, you don't even have to make a Javelin, right? You could hand somebody a Javelin. You don't have to create IED factories like we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they're so much more devastating, so much more consistent, so much more prolific that, if you're a Russian tanker, a Javelin is your worst nightmare, in the same way an IED was for every one of us in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm glad you put a point on that in that way, because it seems to be so clearly shifting the battlefield, but also shifting morale, right, on both sides. The guys, they're already the shirts, praise to St. Javelin, right, that we see all over the place, and it's got to be a nightmare for the Russians. Given your special operations world experience, as much as you're able, Chris, can you evaluate on any level, being this far away, how the special operations units for Ukraine and Russia have done? We heard a lot about Russian special forces, and it may be hard to evaluate right now, but it doesn't look like they were the difference maker we were anticipating. But can you on any level evaluate both sides of that part of this?
First, a comment on like the Javelin ID comparison, and then circle back to that. I think it's a good one. But just for your broader listeners, really what you're trying to do is create this some type of asymmetry, right? Where you're looking to offer solutions that find the seams inside of your opposition's sort of plan, right? And so for us, they're the best technologically enabled military in the world, right? But what they found was, well, what's the weakness on that vehicle, right? The side of it's thin. So let's come up with cheap devices that can blow the door off and like kill the person driving it, right? And then we can attack the convoy. So we've changed their plan by finding non-obvious sort of chinks in the armor. But to your point, improvised explosives devices and vehicle-borne VBIEDs and all these other things that started to evolve. You can't box those up, put them in the border, and just like distribute them, right? So the logistics, it's not as capable of a weapons system. It's sort of this homegrown device, and they got more advanced, of course. But to your point, they had to create factories and get demolition in there, and it's a very complex supply chain and not easy to execute. And then the person that's going out to do it has to like run a wire or set it all up. And so those were days and weeks long operations sometimes. Where this is just, the Russians are smart enough to go, okay, that took them like 5 days to figure out. And this is going to go on for quite a while. So it's a similar sort of imbalance, but a much more sophisticated game. On the special operations side, honestly, I would be completely just guessing at this point. I really look forward to seeing some of the reports that come out once this all sort of starts to settle. My read from the outside is that the majority of the resistance is coming from, just a dedicated army on the Ukrainian side, plus sort of activated civilians that are getting engaged in the conflict. And I'm sure I'm assuming they've distributed their most capable and experienced fighters across to get people up to speed. And what I would assume, like there's probably some specialized units that are doing specialized things, right? But it's not yet a series of like raids or things where you can clearly say, oh, they blew up like these 4 headquarters within 24 hours. So some sort of specialized unit came up with that, right? On the Russian side, again, haven't seen much that's come across my radar. Aside from the initial push, where there was, some of the reports of heavy casualties with some of their lighter units right out of the gates. Again, the history books will say how accurate that is. But my sense was, and this could be completely wrong, but if Putin thought this is going to be, light and fast and low resistance, I'm going to send in some of my shock troops that are all, 6'2", 240 bodybuilders, but lightly armed and not meant to really hold ground, and they don't come in heavily armored, and it'll just kind of scare the population. If the population said, I'm not really impressed, a SEAL platoon's worst nightmare is getting pinned down by like 400 fighters without any support, right? They're not designed to do that. And so I think the Russians might have, and again, I've only seen light reporting on this, might have misused some of its specialized forces out of the gates with the assumption that they weren't going to get much resistance, and they did.
Chris, you're an expert on leadership. You've written books about leadership. Can you break down the leadership differences in the way these militaries are structured? We talk a lot about small unit tactics, about decentralized leadership. You talk about how generals in the Russian army get taken out, and it creates discombobulation because they're so dependent upon those generals, right? That's not the military that I fought in. That's especially not the units that you were in. But can you compare and contrast for the layman the real differences in the way these militaries are structured from a leadership standpoint?
Yeah. Napoleon had the saying that if he could fight anything, he would, like, if he could choose his opponent, he would fight a coalition. Because of all the, you and I both fought within coalitions, right? It's just hard to get a coalition to coordinate and move together, et cetera. I'm no Napoleon, but I would say if I was in today's world, if I was going to fight anything, I would fight an autocrat. I want to fight a society that's been under autocratic rule for generations. And I think that's one of the differences here. I mean, Ukraine's clearly had its ups and downs, like we all have, but it has a relatively recent history of real independent thinking and growth and independence, and an army, a military, a population that is comfortable. And this is why I say it's different now in the technology age, when we're also interconnected and all of us have access to information, et cetera. I mean, this is the first war being fought with Twitter, right? Can you imagine the amount of information that's being exchanged on the front lines through WhatsApp and Instagram accounts that are masked? And it'll just be fascinating to read how effectively the Ukrainians are using technology. But they're very comfortable doing that. They know, like, hey, the kid who lives in that apartment building over here started this masked account, and he's feeding the best information, and it's going straight to other, armed forces that are going to react accordingly, et cetera. And that's because there's a culture that is in this together. They have a common narrative that they share around resistance to occupation of the Russians. And they are, at the individual level, I'm making some assumptions here, but seem clearly comfortable with sort of decentralizing those authorities down to the edge of the resistance in this case. And that's one of the keys to survival, I think, in the information age, whether you're a country, a business, or an army. I'd like to fight an autocrat because they don't like that, right? They want to centrally control information. And if they've been at it long enough and their rule is considered pretty ruthless, like, a Putin, then the individual psyche all the way down to that, that general that's running out to the front line they're not wired for decentralization, right? So there's all sorts of different behaviors that they'll put in place rather than, like the front line's kind of messed up right now. Like this convoy isn't working. Let's get some tech into the kids' hands up there. We'll start communicating, figure out what's going on. No. I've got to run out there. I've got to give the orders, and then I'm going to call back to headquarters and tell them what's going on. And then, a sniper on a WhatsApp account gets a text that says, hey, there's somebody that looks like a general. Boom, I'm going to go take a shot, right? So it's a very imbalanced approach. So that's kind of, again, history will tell how accurate that is, but that's kind of my sense of what I see.
No, I think it's a really important insight, because I think about the students that I taught this fall, undergrads, and there's kind of a sense that this newer generation is all kind of doing their own thing, right? And they're not really loyal to a central organization or bureaucracy, right? They're not joiners in the same way our grandparents' generation was. And now we're seeing the advantage of that on a battlefield, when an individual person or group of people can be self-reliant, can be self-driven, can be networked. And on the other side, you've got, the toy soldiers all lined up behind one autocrat that when you knock out the general, it all kind of spirals apart. So I think that insight is really, really important, Chris, because I don't think anybody has summarized the overall philosophy of the country as a part of their, strategic military weakness in the way that you have, right?
Well, and it's an interesting point. I would agree that there's a generational shift. You and I were somewhere in the middle of that, on joinerness, or whatever the word for it would be.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, humankind, we're all joiners, right? We all find comfort and security. We haven't evolved that quickly, right? It wasn't that long ago that we were all in tribes for just survival. And so we're still wired for that. I just think what connects with people to what they want to join into has shifted. Technology has obviously played a role in that, but the underpinning thing is still around the narrative and the story, right? People want to people will join things that they believe in. And if you went back to, 2 or 3 generations ago, it was harder to get a bunch of stories, right? You got the story from Walter Cronkite, you got the story from the president, whatever it is. And you kind of had these, and your local stories, and you have these easier choices to make. Now you have, thousands of stories you can choose from, and the powerful narrative is what people will align with. But they're still joining something. They're joining a belief. They're joining a story. They're joining a network of some sort. They're just choosing that I'm not going to join the Democratic Party. I'm going to join this movement that happens to be affiliated with that party, because that's the one that really speaks to me.
And they're joining a spirit. They're joining Russian worship. Go fuck yourself. Right? Like that is in the same way we saw in this country how people joined some of the Trump movements of, fuck the man, fuck the system, the government's failing, with these broader narratives that can be so galvanizing, I think, if they're broad enough and if they're invoking enough passion. Chris, I'll ask you if you'll stick around at the end for our Patreon members. I want to ask you like your book recommendations and a couple other things for our folks over there. But before we get to that, if you were president, if you were Secretary of Defense, which I hope you will be one day, this is a tough question, but is there anything you feel we should be doing differently? Part of what the special operations community does is train resistance, and there's a feeling right now among many in Ukraine that we're leaving them to fight it alone. Zelensky keeps turning it up saying we need a no-fly zone, we need MiGs, we need this, we need that. And there's a feeling among many Ukrainians that it's their fight alone. Is there anything that you think the president should be doing, either big picture or little that could be really inspiring or galvanizing for those Ukrainians so they don't feel like they're fighting this alone?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's you have to empathize with anybody at that senior level to think what's at stake, right? And I don't think we're dealing with an insane person, and I think it's to Putin's advantage to make us think he might be. We've had presidents that have played the same game, right? But if you're dealing with someone you think might be willing to take it to the next level and actually use sort of something in his nuclear arsenal, then you have to respect that decision, but you have to make that part of your calculus, right? So I think the no-fly, I think a lot of decisions that have taken place are the right ones, right? Staying away from the no-fly zone, because that escalates very quickly. Being thoughtful about how and what weapon systems we get in there, because again, that could escalate very quickly. And continuing to push on what we were talking about earlier. How can I continue to help this asymmetric fight? And for now, it seems like it's playing out. If anything, I would probably like to have seen even more pressure on the sanctions, pressuring Europeans and others that are still engaged to say, look, you got to ramp this up, right? We've all got to suffer through this together. We got to shut off the pipes. Of course, China would pick up some of that slack, but eventually, that would make Putin completely dependent on Xi for his exports. If that was his only customer, which I'm sure China would be happy to be. Yeah. But so anyway, there's a pressure there that I would like to see ramped up. But I do think, and on the escalation side, I don't think. Here's the one risk that I see there. I don't think you're going to drop like a 50 megaton bomb on Kiev. It just doesn't make any logical sense at all. But what if Putin used like the lowest, and I'm not a nuke person, right? But the lowest yield thing in his arsenal, right? Mm-hmm. Which is classified, right? But you can take a guess at it. And a lot of people might not understand, like, these aren't massive bombs,
yep.
Right?
Yep, we covered that at length with Joe Cerancione in our last episode. That's exactly what he laid out. A smaller tactical nuke, if you will, that takes out a port or sends a statement, right? Says this is the smallest nuke we can use to send a statement, and may have strategic value, may not, but to show you can. Right, is something, and I'm glad you said Putin's not insane, because I think that's too easily thrown around in the media. People say he's crazy, he's unhinged. I think that is too dismissive of an enemy, and I think respecting his capability is something we have to do. So you do think that that's something that is, Joe Cerancione said it's a real possibility. It may not be likely, but it's a possibility, right?
Yeah, and I think it's real because if I was in his court advising him, I would say, look, you're not going to don't drop something big. That's insane because then Moscow will disappear, right? But if you want to do it, I would do it only to change the conversation around nuclear deterrence that's been going on for 60
Right.
years.
Right.
And if you can use a very low yield and convince the world that it's not worth reacting to, you now have a different seat at that broader conversations that have been going on for generations, right? So the deterrence, potentially, the conversation shifts very quickly. Even if you just, and Putin could say, look, US, you dealt with the same thing of like weapons coming in across the border in Iraq or Afghanistan. I put a low yield nuke on this border crossing area where I know there's no population, but I wanted the fallout to close it off so people stop crossing back and forth, right? Blah, 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 make up some story like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even, if it killed 20 people because it's out in the middle of nowhere, you still change the conversation because you're like,
Right.
I use nukes and you can't mess with me.
Right. Chris, related. I don't know how much you can talk about, but one of the commonly understood special operations missions is to secure high value things, right? And we talked with Serancione about the civilian nuke plants that could be potentially unsecure inside Ukraine. I think 15 of them. There's talk of loose nukes. Can you talk about that as a special forces mission for the Ukrainian special forces, or potentially even NATO, and maybe even U.S. forces somewhere else in the world? Can you talk, as much as you're able, can you talk about that part of the special operations mission that is probably being at least game planned, if not executed at some level below the public's knowledge?
I mean, best guess, and it's all it is, but a pretty strong assumption is there's a bunch of teams standing by with pretty specific operations that they'd be ready to execute, and a series of sort of tripwires that would initiate a response like that. You do that, you get into very serious territory, obviously, very quickly. So the tripwires would have to be at a serious global strategic level. But our ability to punch in there and do that, I'm sure is gamed out, ready to go at a very effective level, and probably some folks on standby all around the world to do it. And fortunately, it looks like it's de-escalating right now, so making that less likely. The hope would be on the backside of this, we learn lessons around how much exposure can we afford in that arena, right? Will it drive conversations about improving the security and positioning of those sorts of resources in other countries or in a place like Ukraine?
Chris, what's next? What do you think is going to happen next on the battlefield, or what could happen next on the battlefield that folks may not be thinking about, may not be reading about, given your unique experience and insight? How do you see potentially things unfolding in ways people might not anticipate?
Again, whatever I say here will certainly be proven wrong by Tuesday, because guys.
But you were right about the pandemic, so I'm gonna come back and say here you're better at predicting than most.
Well, I grew up as a wrestler, and I think whatever, this might be overanalyzing people, but I've just come to believe, between the military and business and stuff, if you know someone's, like, if they were a serious athlete, what sport they pursued will tell you a little bit about how they're going to be in the business world or as a military leader, et cetera. Like I never rode crew, but I've worked with a bunch of people that rode crew. Have you ever worked with a person that rode crew seriously? Okay, this guy is, or girl, like, amazing at tolerance for pain. They're like these incredibly intense people. And whether they've rode in years or not, that's just still their approach to life, yeah. Right? Wrestling has its own sort of phenotype. Putin was a very serious judo athlete, and that wires you. I've wrestled with some judo guys, and they're weird, the way they approach the sport, right? Because the whole idea of judo is wherever I'm putting pressure is not where I'm going to attack, right? And so he sort of lived his life like that, right? And so I don't think this went exactly like he thought it would, right? But I think he was applying pressure and will continue to in one area so that he can get something else moving, right? Now that might be over analyzing the way the guy's brain worked, but I think there's some truth to it. So my worst case scenario guess would be, and again, if I was in his court advising, I'd say, look, you got to slow things down. You got to let people forget how bad that initial thing went, which everybody's short-term memory is pretty bad these days. Hold some ground, and we want to get through 2 fighting seasons. And whether that's we back off and we come up with some sort of agreement, I think we're in talks right now, and it's going to escalate up and down. It's going to go kinetic again and come back and forth. But you want to get into a position where the U.S. gets back into its next election cycle, and then you start negotiating point to point with Trump if he runs again. And you could undermine the entire political system where they see you making decisions based on negotiating with someone that's running for president, not the person in the White House, which he would happily do. I mean, RT today had a story about, Biden says Putin should get out, therefore we think Biden should get out and Trump should retake the office, right? So just feeding into that narrative inside the United States. And so, this 2 years in conflict goes by pretty quickly, right? Mm-hmm. I can imagine him dragging it out like that and putting himself on new terms. Coupled with that could be they end up in this weird position somewhere in the country that we, back to that winning and losing question. We're like, well, did we win or lose? Because it seems like the people in that part of Ukraine actually want the occupation, and now we don't know what to make of it anymore.
That is a brilliant breakdown. The judo thing is perfect, and I'm glad you raised that up because this conversation is happening at a time where Trump just this week asked Putin to release information on Hunter Biden. So Trump is now a player in this again. He's inserting himself again. Putin is going to take advantage of that. I've long said if I were Putin, I would just wait until, the Republicans take back Congress, Trump becomes a factor again, and you've got somebody you can deal with, right? Live to fight another day with someone who would be more amenable to you for whatever reason. Let me ask you to go from that very high level to finish on a much lower level. You're also a father. And I asked Biana Golodriga about this in a previous episode, and I think it was really helpful. War, combat. How do you talk to your kids about this? For those of us that are trying to figure out how to talk to children about what we're seeing, can you give us any thoughts on how you and your wife have approached talking to your children about this stuff?
It's a great question. I'm not very good at it, if I'm being honest. And I probably default to not going deep with them on it. In some ways, like I don't think we give our kids enough of a childhood anymore, right? And so you'll figure it out someday, right? So I actually try to shield them from some of it, just because I don't think it matters much to my 11-year-old or 13-year-old what happened in Kyiv yesterday, and I don't want them sitting up at night thinking about it. It's part of the beauty of where we've moved, right? You live in DC or a place like that, like it's all that you're exposed to constantly. I like the fact that my kid's more worried about her softball practice or, bike riding this afternoon with some friends. And I don't know, that could prove to be naive, but I don't think it is. And so when it does come up, which inevitably, it does, I don't tie it back to personal experiences. I avoid that at all costs, really, with the kids. When they're adults and they want to sit around and have a beer and really reflect on that stuff, I'll be ready to have those conversations. But for now, my goal is for my children is to let them be children.
And in fairness to your family, they've spent a lot of time worrying about you over the last couple of decades. So if they can, get a break from it, it's probably overdue and welcome. But you are such an insightful voice, Chris. You're very humble, and I continue to tell you that I think your voice is just one of the most critical on the national stage and in the national dialogue. And every time I get to talk to you, I learn so much, and our audience learns so much. So I'm grateful for your extensive service, of course, in uniform, but even more so your service out of uniform, where you continue to educate us and enlighten us and help us stay ahead of the curve. So thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for joining us again on Independent Americans. I hope you'll come back again soon, my friend.
Oh, you got it. Anytime. Great to see you, and thanks for what you're doing.
And next time it'll be at the car club, and we can get back together and pick up where we left off.
I love it. I still think I have maybe a little bit of that bourbon left that you can.
All right, man. We'll get to it. Stay vigilant, my friend.
Everybody.